Hello once again, everyone. This is the fourth and final part of our Chapter 23 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Anticommunist Crusade. The focus question for this section is, what effects did the anti-communism of the Cold War have on American politics and culture? At the conclusion of World War II, there was no return to normalcy or any sense of the pre-war status quo. The Cold War paradigm led to the permanent establishment of a military-industrial complex and created the situation where issues of national security became the top priority for the American government. And this affected and permeated all issues, both foreign and domestic, at this time. Fear permeated American politics and society as the right to dissent came under attack. And suspicions of communist infiltration led to conformity as the new definition of American loyalty and identity. And one of the first manifestations of this anti-communist crusade was the case of the Hollywood 10, who were a group of American actors and directors who were charged with promoting communist influence in the film industry and to the public through their films, and were forced to testify before Congress to defend themselves and their work. Several high-profile spy cases fueled anti-communist hysteria in the early stages of the Cold War, and these included the cases of Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, all three who were accused of spying for communist USSR in the early 50s, and the Rosenbergs were actually executed in 1953 after they were found guilty of supplying information to the Soviet regime. And then there was Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy was a U.S. senator who cast a broad net and made allegations against numerous people in both public and private spaces, the government and in private business and industry, particularly in Hollywood at this time. And he actually made allegations that there was communist infiltration and influence within the State Department itself. And however, Joseph McCarthy's downfall came with the televised Army McCarthy hearings in the early 1950s, where McCarthy's accusations quickly floundered due to flimsy evidence, and his heavy-handed tactics and general accusatory demeanor led to a severe pushback by the public against him and his efforts. And in general, McCarthyism became shorthand for character assassination, guilt by association, and abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. Yet despite the failure of McCarthy and McCarthyism, there was still a pervasive atmosphere of fear and high anti-communist sentiment within the U.S. during the early period of the Cold War. Individual states formed their own anti-communism investigative committees, and there were no action by the courts, either at the state or the federal level, to halt political repression of socialist and communist ideals and policies. There were multiple uses of the rhetoric of anti-communism in this period, some that were genuine, some that were very disingenuous. In general, it became a popular mass movement, broadly supported amongst the general American populace. Of course, much of that support was a manifestation of this ideal of conformity to traditional American values that became a centerpiece of American politics in society in this period. It was used by government agencies to expand their power. It was used by political parties to damage their opponents. Any accusation of socialist or communist tendencies could stain a political career forever at this point. It was used by businesses to denounce government intervention, which was seen as socialist or communist influence. It's also used to thwart civil rights advancements and uphold sexual morality and traditional gender roles. In the more specific political realm, it was used by Republicans in Congress to stifle Truman's Fair Deal program. And in general, the idea of expanding the New Deal state faded as too socialist, bordering on communist. And in its place, there was a proliferation of private welfare arrangements as the emphasis shifted from government welfare programs to private community welfare programs through such organizations as local churches, Rotary clubs, moose lodges, and the like. So, the question must be asked, given all of the anti-communist sentiment that fueled Cold War ideology in this period, was communism that bad? While it is certainly true that much of the anti-communist rhetoric was exaggerated and overblown based on, this climate of fear, there were some legitimate concerns that were based on the evidence that was coming out of the communist regimes that existed in this period. In general, there were major differences between communism on paper and in practice. And this was best exemplified by the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union and the Maoist regime in China. Both Stalin and Mao were responsible for millions of deaths of dissidents who did not support their regime. And really, the essence of a successful communist regime is broad-based consensus. Everyone has to be on board with it. And in reality, the only way to achieve such consensus in a single-party state is to eliminate the opposition. And both Stalin and Mao were very good at eliminating their opposition. Communism also trades equality of opportunity for equality of outcomes. And again, on paper that might sound very good, but in practice that generally meant that everyone was equally poor, except of course for the ruling class. One of the main planks of communist ideology was the elimination of all class distinctions, but in practice there still has to be a ruling class, those in charge, and in general the ruling class receives all of the benefits and a much higher standard of living than the masses underneath them who don't have access to the benefits that the ruling class in communist regimes do or did. In general, also, communist ideology painted capitalism as inherently evil, and in practice that often translated to it can only be overcome by destroying it and the people that adhere to it. To be fair, however, capitalist democracies did the same thing to communism, which set up a stark dichotomy of good versus evil, with both sides believing wholeheartedly that they were the good side. Despite the surge in Union activity at the immediate conclusion of World War II, as the Cold War escalated in the late 1940s and early 1950s, unions in general had to conform with this anti-communist crusade. If you recall, unions had long been associated with socialist or communist tendencies, so there was a marked effort at this period to diminish at least the appearance of such influence. And in general, unions were required to cooperate with the Anticommunist Crusade or face destruction. As far as civil rights issues went, most black organizations also went along with anti-communism and the Anticommunist Crusade. And there was a shift in thinking amongst black organizations and civil rights leaders toward demonstrating how racism damaged the American image abroad and played into the Russians' hands. And with that, we conclude our lecture series for Chapter 23 of your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.